At the same time that the end of World War II and the dawn of the Cold War ushered in civil distrust and accusations of disloyalty, the time period also represented a period of relative economic prosperity across the nation. But lest we think that these things were somehow disjointed, the prosperity of the 50s was very much intertwined with ideas of conformity and pressure to act according to specific social mores. Those who acted out of sorts in their political leanings or spending habits or religious affiliations or social sphere risked alienation and the tag of communist sympathies. So, in this way, the era of prosperity and the pressure to conform to capitalist ideals with that prosperity were very much tied to the Red Scare mentality of the 50s. One of the things we have to understand about this time period in terms of prosperity is that Eisenhower was key to the shift towards what's often referred to as modern republicanism. Eisenhower was the first Republican elected to the executive branch since the start of the Great Depression, and as such, he realized that his party needed to modernize their approach to government. This included things like accepting New Deal policies as the reality of life. Eisenhower didn't agree with big government expansion and things like federalized healthcare and civil rights legislation that Truman's Fair Deal put forward, but he also wasn't in favor of the radical ideas people in his party had either, like eliminating the very safeguards that kept the economy from collapsing or getting rid of Social Security. In fact, Eisenhower's administration expanded Social Security. And so when we talk about prosperity during this time period, some of this has to do with increased government spending on domestic projects, which occurred steadily under Eisenhower's presidency and hasn't decreased since. But it also has to do with the recreation of the political sphere too, and creating stability for existing programs while creating new ones. One of the laws that helps in this prosperity, which for context isn't one passed by Eisenhower but by Roosevelt in 1944, is the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, better known as the GI Bill. So the background of the GI Bill is that despite what you may have been propagandized to think, we have never actually been particularly great to our returning servicemen. Like, quick rehash of just sort of recent events, some states in the South, like Texas, had issues with men returning from World War I and not being able to vote because they hadn't paid their poll taxes on account of being overseas, so they were disenfranchised. Black veterans have consistently been harassed and outright murdered for simply wearing their uniforms in public. And during the Great Depression, the bonus army of veterans that marched on Washington were called communists by the federal government and dispelled with tear gas and bayonets, an action that killed at least one serviceman's infant child. Not to mention that when servicemen return from war and suffer from PTSD, which we obviously aren't calling that at this point, men are repeatedly told to man up or to get over it and left to die of alcoholism. And this list doesn't even include the women who serve overseas, often in military capacities but without military distinctions, so that when they are hurt or killed, there's no help for them or their families. So taking that into account, the basic premise of the Bill here is to maybe start doing something for our returning servicemen to help them readjust to society after World War II, hence the name, Servicemen's Readjustment Act. And so what this law does is provide for a few things for veterans and their families, like college education, job placement services, low-interest housing loans, and healthcare benefits through the VA. And so for the thousands of servicemen who were honorably discharged from service after World War II, this law provides benefits that they can use to rebuild their lives. Because remember, these men had to give up their jobs and lives that they couldn't always return to when they volunteered or were drafted. And the government is like, well, that's not your fault. And so this is a way of rewarding the men who served, which honestly, in my less than objective historical opinion, is one of the better things that Congress has ever done with their budget. But the problem with the GI Bill, despite its many benefits, is that those benefits didn't reach all servicemen. This law and the services it provides are essentially what we can think of as a form of affirmative action for cisgender, heterosexual white men. Because as we learned with World War II, tons of both gay men and African American soldiers were given Section 8 blue discharge papers throughout their duration of World War II, which wasn't exactly a dishonorable discharge, but wasn't an honorable discharge either, which meant that they didn't qualify for GI Bill benefits. And on top of that, African American soldiers who did receive GI Bill benefits often couldn't use them to their full capacity. When it comes to Black veterans, the vast majority lived in southern and western states, which were still massively segregated under Jim Crow. In terms of education, when they took their GI vouchers to colleges around where they lived, they were turned away because those schools wouldn't accept them. Despite the fact that black colleges existed, those schools simply couldn't take in the massive quantity of new students who wanted to attend, and so many African American veterans were left waiting and wanting for a college education. So the next logical idea would be to get a job. But even there, African American veterans were looking for work and were massively overqualified for the jobs that white Jim Crow employers were willing to provide. When they went to the job placement services provided by the military, they were told that despite their experience as plane engineers, mechanics, or operators, they'd have to take a job as a cook or cleaner. And since the job insurance was only available to those willing to keep a job, these kinds of low-paying jobs were the ones that they were forced to take, rather than remaining unemployed for a few weeks to find something more lucrative or better matched to their skill set. Meanwhile, white GIs found Southern jobs comfortably in the growing military-industrial complex, which hired veterans because of their skill sets. In housing, black veterans were afforded the same low-interest government loans as white veterans, but only if those homes weren't in white neighborhoods. So while white GIs used the GI Bill to immediately get a college degree or find better paying work and use that and the low interest loans to purchase a home in the suburbs, black GIs were often relegated to low paying jobs in colleges that either couldn't or wouldn't accept them, and neighborhoods where they weren't allowed to live even if they had the money. Of course, this wasn't the case for all African American veterans. One can find plentiful examples of black GIs who attended prestigious college programs as a result of the GI Bill, and one went on to live very comfortable middle or upper class lifestyles, or even a fortunate number who managed to find work in their specialized field and didn't have to go to college to make a living. As we know well by this point, no group is a monolith in their experience, and the successes of these individuals shouldn't be dismissed. But when we look at the GI Bill as a legal structure, we have to see its successes and failures. It was wildly successful at setting up a foundation for providing aid to returning veterans and their families. But in the 1940s and 50s, the GI Bill also reflected and repeated values of systemic racism that impacted generations of Americans, creating multiplied wealth of white middle-class Americans while leaving African Americans economically behind. And this isn't the first time we've seen this. As just one example, the Homestead Act in 1862 created the opportunity for white families to buy up 160-acre plots of land to create farms for themselves at the exclusion of black communities and at the exclusion and expense of indigenous populations. And with that, those white families and communities used that land to multiply their wealth across generations, while landless black communities, who would become citizens 6 years later, were left with essentially nothing to start from economically. And then for decades after that, those same white communities actively worked to prevent the same black communities from gaining property through state-based legislation. These actions are never done in a vacuum, and we should never see them as such. So if the GI Bill is one of the things that leads to prosperity during this time period, one of the things that serves as a general indicator of economic prosperity is the baby boom. The reason that a baby boom happened in the wake of World War II can't really be attributed to a singular thing, because it was really a mixture of causes happening all at once that led to the boom on quite this scale. First, we have a general increase in the standard of living. In terms of trends, this is actually pretty common. When there's a war, we tend to see a general increase in the standard of living for most people because, one, wars usually bring about new technology and eventually that makes its way into the general population. And two, increased government spending during wartime will generally also be spent domestically and have some tangible benefits there. A lot of this also has to do with the GI Bill that we just discussed. More people are going to college and becoming generally better educated and have more access to regular health care. Second, although closely tied to the first, is new medical advances. During World War II, Alexander Fleming's discovery of penicillin during the 1920s is actively used to create antibiotics. After the war, these are widely used to treat a variety of illnesses, not exactly for the first time, but at least broadly and widely available to most people at a lower cost. Really significantly, Dr. Jonas Salk created the first polio vaccine in 1955, which, once distributed, effectively eradicated that disease in the United States. Since polio's crippling, literally, effects afflicted children most severely, this was a huge step forward in pediatric medicine. And third, probably the most obvious reason for the baby boom, and again, not a new trend, was men returning home from war. It's not entirely surprising that babies would be the logical result of most newlywed couples finally getting to see each other after months apart. If you look at the population charts over time, you'll see at least a slightly abnormal increase in births after pretty much every American conflict. Some of the effects of the baby boom are more obvious than others. Most obvious would be tons of babies. Duh. But even more than that, the baby boom makes the low interest loan aspect of the GI Bill really quite critical. Because most of these newlywed couples, which not all of them were, but most of them were young, were living in really small living spaces, either apartments or maybe a one-bedroom house sort of arrangement. And if you've ever occupied a space with an infant for more than about 5 minutes, you know that this sort of arrangement simply won't work. So these families are looking for new housing, and the GI Bill is there to help them. Because with a low interest loan, they can buy or build a new home pretty much anywhere. We'll talk about what this looks like in just a minute. But essentially, with all of these new families, one of the effects of the baby boom is there is a housing shortage in the United States, and someone needs to fill it. The other major effect here is that you start to see this whole genre of self-help books, or at least mommy help books, that pop up for new mothers. Because let's be real, not every woman is born with maternal instincts. Like me, I really cannot stand small children. And so you have all of these women who have these infants who just like simply will not stop crying. And they haven't slept in like 25 days and they simply don't know what to do. But gender norms of the day dictate that you can't admit that you don't know what to do. You're supposed to be good at this. So in comes Dr. Benjamin Spock to save you. In his common sense book of baby and child care, he tells you that all of the secrets are there for taking care of a child. So for example, if your baby is crying, you essentially need to troubleshoot it like you would a computer. Check the diaper, try to feed it, try putting on more or less clothing to see if it's too hot or cold, see if it has a fever, check to see if there is snot or something else up its nose. Once all of these things have failed, then call the doctor, not before. Or if your baby has a fever, he'll tell you what temperature of a fever is actually a big deal. Or teach you cool tricks like how to suck snot out of your baby's nose with a straw when they have a sinus infection, which is gross, but everyone does it because it works. And so because he saves them from looking stupid, mothers love Dr. Spock. This is the precursor to the what to expect when you're expecting book that we have today. But then there's a section of the book that also tells mothers how to be good mothers in a more traditional sense. So apart from the practical section, Dr. Spock is still a dude giving women advice. He tells them that in order to raise a healthy baby, women should be stay-at-home mothers because children need a stabilizing force who will be there to meet their needs. Because according to his opinion, children are like a block of clay, and it's a mother's job to help sculpt them into a beautiful figure. Raising children is about helping them to reach their potential. So essentially, the message that all babies are born perfect. So if yours turns out to be a serial killer or weird in some other way, it's because you didn't try hard enough as a mother. So when we talk later about a women's movement and women's disillusionment with their lives, this is part of the reason why. But just as we've seen across other time periods, the idyllic version of motherhood is really reserved for white women. Medical professionals in the US government begin with the presumption that women of color are bad mothers and craft their policies accordingly. Probably the most egregious example of this is the forced sterilization of women in Puerto Rico in the 1950s. At this point, the medical researchers were testing out versions of what is now the estrogen birth control pill taken by thousands of women in the United States. But in the 1950s, the pill was in its trial versions really, that had varying levels of hormones and extremely intense side effects. The federal government allowed researchers to test the pill on women in Puerto Rico, which was incredibly controversial since many of the residents there were Catholic and didn't use birth control. Nevertheless, researchers forced college women at the University of Puerto Rico to partake in the study and held their grades hostage until they completed it. Nearly half of the women dropped out as a result. Since this wasn't an effective sample size, they then tried using the women in the island's prisons and then moved on to the poorer neighborhoods. The researchers couldn't find willing women in the neighborhoods, just like they couldn't find them at the college. And the reason had to do with the fact that these women didn't want to take birth control on top of forced sterilization that was already happening. Puerto Rican women didn't tend to use birth control. Assumptions are that it had to largely do with their Catholic faith. This led to what the government believed to be an overpopulation problem on the island, and as a result, they enacted a policy of forced sterilization. Hospitals would sterilize women after giving birth. In some instances, hospitals would refuse to admit a woman in labor until she signed a consent form to be sterilized. A study conducted in 1965 found that of women who had given birth in the 1920s, nearly half had been sterilized. These types of sterilizations weren't only in Puerto Rico, though. In the 1960s, the Young Lords led a protest against forced sterilizations in Puerto Rico, but also against similar forced sterilizations happening to Puerto Rican women in New York. The women of the Young Lords were abundantly aware that Puerto Rican, Black, and other minority women in cities like New York faced similar coercion as the women of Puerto Rico when it came to forced sterilization procedures. Presumed to be bad mothers, hospitals admitting these women to have children often refused to admit them until they signed waivers to be sterilized after giving birth. Meanwhile, white mothers in the suburbs continued having as many children as the suburban lifestyles would allow. If their two-bedroom starter home wasn't large enough, they'd simply sell it to another young family and buy a larger one down the road or in the next town. The neighborhoods that white people were moving into were in the suburbs. And really, the model for suburban living during this period was crafted by real estate developer William J. Levitt, who created neighborhoods that are commonly referred to as Levitt towns. These are made up of relatively low-cost prefab homes that people buy essentially out of a catalog and have built with a little bit of customization. And so what you end up with are neighborhoods that look more or less exactly the same. This really shouldn't be a super foreign concept to us because in most of the southern suburbs we have today, this is kind of the model we still use, just with a really more modernized design and more options for homes, which are actually stupidly more expensive options. So for example, here we have some options of what people might be choosing from when purchasing a home. You'd pick from one of the outside designs, then on the inside you'd choose from which version of the kitchen you want, which kind of bathroom you like, which kind of carpet you want, and so on and so forth. And assuming you want essentially just the basics and nothing fancy added in, this house should cost you about $8,490, which in 2020 would be approximately $79,000. This is a ridiculously cheap price. To provide a comparison, my husband and I are currently in the process of building a brand new house. We chose to go with pretty much only the basic features since our builder's standard features are actually pretty nice from the start, and our 3-bedroom, 1-story house will end up costing about $330,000 before we put any furniture in it. So add on to this that tons of people buying these houses are going to be able to get a low interest loan for the house due to the GI Bill, and it's like they're essentially giving them away. And this was important because remember, part of the problematic effects of the baby boom was that it created a housing shortage. So Levitt's systems help with that problem. By creating homes that are essentially the same floor plan, save a few changes here or there, he's able to create houses that can be built super fast. And because they're efficient to build, they're cheap to build. So we end up with neighborhoods that look like this, ones that I'm sure we're all familiar with on some level today because we either drive past them or through them all the time. Unlike neighborhoods in the Northeast that are sort of organically made and have sometimes weird streets that curve and turn everywhere, these pre-planned neighborhoods have straight streets and parallel structures that intersect one another, are often put into convenient zones, and sometimes have amenities like community green areas or parks. With this, though, comes expectations. The expectation that you'll conform to certain gardening and lawn rules, expectations for where to park your car or not park your car, expectations for decorating for the holidays. But most important, coded into the covenants and restrictions, or HOA rules, were racially restrictive covenants, which legally said that white families couldn't resell their homes to minority families or individuals. At the same time, banks refused mortgages to minority individuals who wanted to live in white neighborhoods or even near white neighborhoods in some cases through redlining and other restrictive actions. These rules worked to reinforce Jim Crow segregation in new housing developments even after the Brown versus Board decision in 1954. The practice of redlining wasn't outlawed until 1968 with the Fair Housing Act, and in other ways, the practice continued long after that. So the suburbs, for the most part, solved the issue of population boom that the post-war baby craze caused, but just like we saw with the GI Bill, also worked to reinforce Jim Crow standards across the United States. It's important to pause for a brief second and note that the suburbs weren't an invention of the 1950s. People have been moving gradually to what would be considered suburban areas since as long as the transportation technology would allow them to live far enough away from their place of work, but also get to work on time without it being an obnoxious commute. So essentially since the invention of the car and in some areas good mass transportation networks. But what's unique about the particular suburbs we see pop up in the 50s is that they, one, are massive in their growth, like we just saw, and two, the movement of people to the suburbs takes on a very specific geographic trend. The kind of movement that we see during this period is known as Rust Belt Sun Belt movement. If you look at the image here, the line in the middle, the 37th parallel, pretty close to the 3630 parallel, if you remember from the Missouri Compromise, is the Sun Belt. States along and below this belt are where families tend to move to and through during the 50s and 60s. The Rust Belt, seen here in red, is where people typically move from. So in terms of push-pull factors here, the thing that's pulling people to the Sunbelt region is primarily jobs, which shouldn't be surprising because jobs are always the pull factor for pretty much all migration, although what those jobs look like differ. In this case, a lot of the jobs are in what are now called the military-industrial complex, so companies that are fueling the Cold War effort in terms of technology and research, companies like today's Texas Instruments, Raytheon, etc. People are also moving here because this is where the housing is. Although the two things are closely tied, they build housing where the jobs are. A lot of what used to be sharecropping land is now being bought up by real estate developers and turned into massive neighborhoods for new families. So when you drive by a neighborhood with some cutesy name like something farms, it literally might have used to be a farm at one point. The thing pushing people out of the Rust Belt region is really partially their own racism. We know that between World War I and World War II, tons of African Americans moved north in the respective Great Migrations. This means that more than ever before, cities like Chicago, New York City, and Detroit, to name a few, now have flourishing black neighborhoods. In the 20s, this is largely what contributed to the Harlem Renaissance that gave us an amazing outpouring of new music, art, and literature. But in the 1950s, racist white people didn't want to live with or near these black communities, so they picked up and left to go, ironically really, to the South or Sun Belt, where they could live in their segregated, spaced-out neighborhoods. This isn't to say that the North didn't have Jim Crow to insulate white people from minority communities. That was totally a thing. But remember, even though racism has always existed in all parts of this country, structural racism was at least slightly more overt and obvious in the legal structures of the South. And so we know that the Sun Belt is called that, or can presume it's called that, because of the sun. Spending time in California or Arizona or Texas or Florida, you'll immediately notice that it's hot. Although spend time with someone from any of those states for a few minutes and you'll immediately get into a fight about whose weather is hotter and, well, it depends on what kind of heat you're talking about, etc., etc. But we clearly get where the name comes from. So where does Rust Belt come from? It's easy. Things fall apart. Literally. When people leave these states in droves and new people don't move in, especially people in the middle and upper economic classes, the businesses that are there to employ people eventually shut down. This includes a lot of those larger factories and industrial plants who have been there since essentially the Gilded Age in the 1920s, including some of our car manufacturers. This is what happens in Flint, Michigan. And once they leave, people are left without jobs and end up in poverty. And so the rest of the city starts to really fall apart, hence rust. The problem is that things fall further and further apart, and it becomes harder and harder to convince new people to move there. Who wants to move to a city that's falling apart? Nobody. And so the people who can leave do. The people who can't leave are stuck there. And then because everything is falling apart, the property values plummet, and there's no tax base to support things like schools, which means that now children aren't getting things that they need in order to become successful. So now the students graduating from high school don't have the tools to go out and become successful, and they get stuck. Wash, rinse, repeat. And the people who are left in the Rust Belt areas are overwhelmingly minority communities. And then when they fall into a cycle of poverty and ask the government for assistance because the tax base has fallen out from under them due to this massive migration and other things, that's really simplifying it a lot, the government tends to respond that it's not their job to provide aid because that's a state or local issue, except that the state and local governments can't help either because they're dependent upon the taxpayers who are asking for help. Now, it's not entirely fair or accurate to say that this is completely a race-based issue because it's not. It's also an economic issue that cuts across racial lines because there's a lot of tons of poor white people who live in the Rust Belt region who stay in those regions in the same position. But as we've seen with labor and economic issues since the Gilded Age and even before that, politicians have spent generations telling poor white people that their identity is primarily wrapped up in their race, despite the fact that they likely have more in common with non-white people of similar economic class. And so between these racial groups, they continue the general prevalence of Jim Crow, which actively works against their ability to stabilize and grow economically, or forge any political alliances that might actually forcefully advocate for their position on a national stage. I know this to be true even beyond historical evidence because I was born and raised in one of these communities myself on the outskirts of Detroit. One of the other signs of prosperity was the Interstate Highway Act in 1956. Today we're so accustomed to having interstates all around us. In the Dallas area especially, we've got several interstate highways that intersect and create a mess downtown. So it's hard to imagine a world where they wouldn't be there. But before the 1950s, the next best thing we had were state highways and farm-to-market roads that tended to be larger or better-kept roads, plus toll roads if you wanted to pay for them. But in 1956, Eisenhower pushed for the Interstate Highway Act because he wanted to have a system of roads that were controlled by the federal government and stretched across the entire country in case of disaster. Because if you think about it, they were living in an intense time of fear that at any point the USSR might drop a giant bomb on the United States. And so if they needed to deploy troops or emergency workers or someone to a city in the country, they needed to be able to do that quickly. And at that point, they didn't have the ability to do that. So with the interstate highway system, the federal government has the ability to shut down the roadways in the case of an emergency to move FEMA or the National Guard or anyone else without interruption as fast as they need to. All federal highways are even wide enough to land a plane on if they have to. In some ways, this was both a cause and effect of general economic prosperity coming out of the Second World War. The highway system ended up costing $119 billion as of 1996, but didn't add to the national debt. As a Republican dedicated to ensuring that the size, and therefore spending, of the government remained small, he insisted that his project be self-liquidating, or self-funding, to put it another way. To do this, Eisenhower told Congress to set up a system where the states would pay for parts of the road as they built it with loans from the federal government, and then those loans would be paid back through excise taxes on gasoline by drivers on the roads. They were able to do all of this because coming out of World War II, we were in a really stable financial position to essentially loan ourselves money. The interstate highway system also created economic prosperity because it created economic growth. In addition to creating jobs for the people actually building the road, it led to new businesses popping up around the highway. Just like we saw businesses in towns popping up along the Transcontinental Railroad during the Gilded Age, the 50s and 60s saw all kinds of new businesses like mini-marts, new gas stations, fast food places, and motels pop up around the interstates. And all of these things created jobs and new revenue streams for people. The expectation was that people would spend this new revenue from whatever their new income stream was on consumer goods, because in the 50s, just like in the 20s, there was a whole new host of consumer goods out there. And the idea was that families should be filling their new wholesome homes with these things. And as part of this, we have an entire advertising boom that goes with it, like you see here. So the idea here isn't necessarily to sell you a product, but to sell you a lifestyle. That, like, if you look at the image on the right, you totally need to have a swimming pool, even though there's a lake right there to swim in, because that makes sense. And of course, we have our picturesque white family here with mom and dad and Susie and Bobby. I mean, all they're missing is the dog Skip. They've even got a box of Wheaties, because the idea here is not only can you afford these things, but you deserve these things. And because America deserves these things as the capitalist and democratic inheritors of all good things in the world. And if you don't want these things, there's something wrong with you. Some of the more popular things you'd see advertised were appliances. So here we've got a refrigerator, which, like, I don't know about you, but I've literally never had a refrigerator this full of food. But the idea is like, ooh, look at how much other consumer crap you can fit in here. This is no different than today with the fridges that have like the cool features, like the thing where you can knock on the door and it shows you what's inside, or the middle drawer thing for stuff you use all the time so you're not constantly opening the doors, which, let's be real, we all do anyway. But it's essentially the same concept, different generation. They want you to buy it not because there's anything wrong with your old refrigerator, which honestly probably functions just fine, but because it's new and fun. And then we've got ads like our cola advertisement. If you look at the fine print down at the bottom, which is so much more writing than you'd ever see in an ad today, it's telling mothers that they should start giving their babies or toddlers soda pretty much immediately, because otherwise they'll grow up to be losers. Like, literally, that's what it says. You can Google the ad. It says that giving babies and children soda will help them grow up to be socially cool and help them to fit in better. So if you don't give them soda at a young enough age, they'll be losers. And remember what Dr. Spock said about your kid being a loser. That's totally on you. Now, this ad is sponsored by the Soda Pop Board of America. Today, we'd call that Big Sugar. Sometimes you hear about big fill in the blank, like Big Pharma is another common one, or Big Tobacco. These are large conglomerates of companies who have similar interests. And so obviously, we know that giving babies and young children soda and other sugary stuff is really bad for them. But when Big Sugar controls all of the advertising around this, and all of them are telling people the same thing, and they're also the ones secretly, or sometimes not so secretly, funding the research that says, nah, it's fine, folks, then it creates the problem. This is exactly what happens with tobacco. Tobacco companies knew for decades that cigarettes and tobacco cause cancer. This was very obvious to them, but they spend tons of money on advertisement and scientific studies that they funded to argue that it didn't, or at least to cover it up, or to bribe politicians into not enacting even basic regulations. This is why it's incredibly important for us to have things like double-blind studies and to know who pays for scientific research, and have all research vetted through academic peer review. Otherwise, you might as well not read it at all because it's useless. But nevertheless, companies in the 50s used these masterful and colorful advertisements to get people to buy things in advertising campaigns, which is relatively new. And this helps fuel the consumer boom. This wave of prosperity that lasted for most of the 50s and into the 1960s was tied critically to conformity, because at its core, the consumerism of the 50s was rooted in American capitalism, which stood in stark contrast to Soviet communism. And so Americans, by their nature, had to go all out in performative capitalism and democratic participation in order to not be seen as communist sympathizers. This didn't just mean in terms of literally buying things, although that was certainly part of it. But Americans were expected to subscribe and conform to all aspects of what were considered capitalist and democratic aspects of society, or at least not challenge them. This included traditional gender roles, men went to work, women stayed home to raise kids. It also included maintaining standards of Jim Crow segregation. As we'll see in discussions about African American civil rights during this period, those who challenged segregation during the 50s were almost uniformly branded as communists. And so in reality, the prosperity and capitalist systems that go with that went hand in hand with conforming to the ideals that prevented people from being branded as communists or communist sympathizers during the age of McCarthyism. But even if you want to take a less sinister look at ideas of conformity, because McCarthy's reign didn't last forever, the psychological ideal of fitting in or keeping up with the Joneses remained due to predominantly white Protestant ideals that we've seen carried across generations since the colonial era. One of the things that carries over in terms of gender roles from really the pre-Civil War era is the cult of domesticity, or the idea that a woman's proper place is in the home. Or even deeper than that, the idea that a woman is most fulfilled in life, that her perfect place in life is being a wife and mother. That this is the way that women fulfill their destiny in the world. That this is what women are built for. And all of this really goes back to very traditional Protestant religious gender norms that we've seen since essentially Puritan New England. And so, just like we saw with Dr. Spock and his child rearing advice that women should devote themselves to their children, you also have all of this advice for women on how to devote themselves in a larger capacity to the home. Because the home, marriage, children, and the literal space they occupy, is a reflection of the self, the spirit. And in a super broad sense, the collective homes in the United States and their collective health and happiness are a reflection of a working democracy. And in the Cold War, that needs to reflect something that is happy and working well. So we have all of these self-help, or really woman help, guides in magazines and newspaper articles that tell women how to cook and clean and care for the home and their families and husbands. The one we have here is from May 1955's Housekeeping Monthly, The Good Wife's Guide. It gives women advice on how to be a good wife. Duh. I know the print here is really small, so I'll give you some of the highlights. Here we go. Quote, have dinner ready. Plan ahead even the night before to have a delicious meal ready on time for his return. This is a way of letting him know that you have been thinking about him and are concerned about his needs. Most men are hungry when they come home, and the prospect of a good meal, especially his favorite dish, is part of the warm welcome needed. Listen to him. You may have a dozen important things to tell him, but the moment of his arrival is not the time. Let him talk first. Remember, his topics of conversation are more important than yours. Make the evening his. Never complain if he comes home late or goes out to dinner or other places of entertainment without you. Instead, try to understand his world of strain and pressure and his very real need to be at home and relax. This is one of my favorites, since it literally just told you to spend like 2 days making dinner, but now it's totally chill for him to blow you off and go out to eat. Cool, cool. Quote, don't complain if he's late home for dinner or even if he stays out all night. Count this as minor compared to what he might have gone through that day. Awesome. And then paired with this suspicious behavior, quote, don't ask him questions about his actions or question his judgment or integrity. Remember, he is the master of the house and as such will always exercise his will with fairness and truthfulness. You have no right to question him. And then my personal favorite, she said with utmost sarcasm, quote, a good wife always knows her place. Today, a lot of women would look at this and probably think, excuse me? And to be totally fair, there were a substantial portion of women in the 50s who totally thought the same thing. But a lot of other women bought into this line of thinking in some form or fashion, even if not all of it, because this was totally the expectation. It was the expectation for them, for their mothers, and their mothers before them. Even when we had moments where women were heavily involved in the workforce, like World War I and World War II, it was still the expectation that women would go home at night and cook and clean and take care of the family. And to an extent, we still see this today. One of the things we see in op-eds and magazines and newspapers several times a year are articles, usually by women, about the unpaid work that women do on top of the careers they have outside the home. Women go to their full-time jobs and then come home after that and do the vast majority of work taking care of children and doing cleaning and cooking, because that is the traditional role that women have always played. And so even when we see women's roles expanding in terms of civil rights and economic mobility and political power, those same women are also often juggling traditional gender roles on top of that. But what's different about the cult of domesticity versus what we have today and even in other time periods is that it says that women shouldn't want those other things. Even if women are going to continue doing traditional gender roles, they shouldn't go out and be politicians or CEOs or have a job. Once a woman is married, her place should be in the home. That's where she should be fulfilled by being a wife and a mother. And if that isn't fulfilling enough, it's because she's doing it wrong. Now, despite this cult of domesticity, or perhaps not despite, but happening at the same time, overlapping with, are what we call pink-collar jobs. So in the sort of job dividing spheres, we usually have white-collar jobs, which are office-type jobs where you'd wear a white-collared button-down shirt, and blue-collar jobs that are more manual labor, so think like blue coveralls. But both of these fields are dominated at this point pretty much by men. So pink collar jobs are jobs that are socially acceptable for unmarried women to do. Emphasis on unmarried. And this isn't like a new concept. We've seen this before with telegraph and telephone operators in the Gilded Age, or the concept that it's pretty much always been acceptable for unmarried women to be teachers. Because in these arenas, the jobs are considered to be helpers in society. They're doing a public good. And so when women fill these kinds of jobs, they're considered to be respectable. So what these kinds of pink collar jobs are doing is expanding the kinds of jobs fit into this mold, or that fit into this mold, because with the invention of new forms of technology, there are new forms of jobs out there. So this comes to include things like working in a department store, which we really saw become a thing in the Gilded Age in the 20s, but it's really taken off at this point. Or a woman could become a childcare worker, think preschool or kindergarten. This is essentially both because women are staying in the workforce after World War II instead of going back into the home, and because some women join all of these social clubs and organizations and don't want to be toting their kids around to meetings. Or if you're in for a wild adventure, you could be a flight attendant. This was a bit of a double-edged sword because the job meant a sense of real independence, obviously great travel benefits, but the airlines also held women to an incredibly strict physical standard that only got worse over time. And in literally any of these jobs, women could be fired the moment they got engaged or married, because employers were totally on board for the most part with the idea that a woman's place should be in the home, taking care of her family. Plus, on the more practical side, if you fired a woman because she was getting married, you could hire a new chick fresh off the streets and pay her less because she was younger and less experienced. So at the same time that pink-collar jobs gave women, especially young women, a sense of incredible independence, especially economic independence, they also reinforced the gender norms of the day. Just like every other time period we've seen, not everyone is following the general societal trend. Not everyone is conforming. In the 1950s, the most obvious face of rebellion to conformity takes the form of the Beat Generation, otherwise known as the Beatniks. They were a group of mostly intellectuals and writers who advocated for rebellion, especially against larger society and politics, and spontaneity, and increasingly came to see their part of the generation as pitted against the rest of the world, or at least the rest of the world pitted against them and their ideas. The general makeup of the Beatniks was really super white and predominantly male. That's not to say that there weren't minority voices in the Beat Generation or women, but the sort of core leadership tended to skew really white and really male. But here, for example, we can see some of the fashion that tended to be indicative of the Beat Generation women. The hat in particular would be a huge tip-off, as would the striped shirt in many cases. And on the left, we have a poem by Bob Kaufman, who is one of the more predominant African-American beat poets, who featured, or tended to feature, jazz in several of his poems as a central sort of feature, contrasting the happiness and smoothness of jazz with harsher realities like war and death. And so these influences obviously did exist within the Beats, but white male leaders like Ginsberg, Carr, and Kerouac didn't see them as central to their message. Prosperity in the 1950s had much to do with the economic position of the United States coming out of World War II. Eisenhower and Congress were able to use that position to pass laws creating economic supports that would set most Americans on a better footing than they had been for the last generation. But at the same time, the prosperity came with the understanding the United States' position as a capitalist and democratic superpower was under attack, and Americans must conform to certain ideas or be seen as less than members of society. When it came to the fight for civil rights, African Americans found this balance incredibly difficult and sometimes impossible to balance, and actively chose to fight for democracy as it should be, not as it was.